We still have a couple people coming in. So, but anyway, welcome to Live from Austen Variation, Jaff and June. I'm one of a group of authors of Austen-inspired fiction, and we blog together at the Austen Variations group blog, and we're all feeling kind of sad earlier that all the Jane Austen festivals were being canceled because of coronavirus, and so we came up with this idea of doing this event so that we could get together somehow, and it's really been very nice being able to see people virtually. And let's see, gotta get everything muted correctly. Okay, there we go. So we're really glad you've joined us. This is hopefully going to be a lot of fun. What I'm going to be talking about is things that are hidden in plain sight in Pride and Prejudice. As I thought I knew Pride and Prejudice really, really well before I started writing Jane Austen inspired fiction. I probably read it 20 or 30 times. I'd studied it in college. I thought I knew it really quite well. But when you're writing Austen inspired fiction, you look at different things and you learn different things and you go down lots of deep rabbit holes doing research. And I'm going to share some of the things I've learned there from that, because I've learned there are things that we miss now. We tend to see Pride and Prejudice through a sort of clouded window. Part of that is because it doesn't take place in the present time and we see it with our present modern view. Part of it is because no matter how young we read it, we've all heard about Pride and Prejudice before we read it. We all come in with preconceived notions. And then there's the adaptations, the movies and the miniseries, which have clouded our views too. Even when we know it's not in the book, sometimes those images just stick with us and maybe they're not completely correct. So what I'm going to do today is go back to the book. What I'm going to be talking about is the book and pointing out some things that I think have gotten lost in that sort of clouded window that we look through. And hopefully give you some new views on Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to throw in some shocking theories of what I think a Regency reader reading it for the first time would have seen that you might not have. So let me get started here. The first thing I'm going to talk about is things that actually happen in Jane Austen's words. One of the things I learned very early on with this is you have to pay a lot of attention to what Jane Austen describes, even if it's just in a phrase. Jane Austen doesn't describe very much in Pride and Prejudice. If I'm writing a scene where, say, I want Elizabeth to talk to Charlotte Lucas privately, I sit there and think, okay, what would get her to go over to Lucas Lodge? Set this up. Would they meet while she's walking? Would they meet in the parlor? Would they meet in Charlotte's room? Where would they meet? Let's look at what Jane Austen does. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast and in a private conversation with Elizabeth related the event of the day before. She just dumps us right there. She doesn't go through any of this trouble to set up scenes. And it works, it's great. But what it tells us is that when she does give us those details, it's important. So let's go back and start at the very beginning. Let's see, I'm attempting to share my screen. Is that working? Are you seeing a picture of Netherfield Park? Jennifer, can you wave your hand if you're seeing it? Okay, thank you. Let's start with Netherfield Park is let at last. We all take that for granted and don't even think about it, but let's stop and think about Netherfield Park is let at last. What does this tell us about the story? First of all, it tells us that one of the neighbors of the Bennets with a fancy house can no longer afford to live there. The neighborhood and their society has become unstable. People are losing their houses. They might still own it, but they can't afford to live there. She also tells us it was let at last. It's been a long time that Netherfield has been empty. Why, we don't know, but it does suggest that maybe Netherfield isn't such a prize, you know, that no one has wanted to rent it until now. So here we are, Netherfield Park has let it last, and it isn't a prize, since we're also told that Bingley just showed up one day, looked at it very briefly, and decided to take it. Presumably didn't go through the books, didn't talk to lots of people, didn't check to see whether there was dry rot, just looks nice, I'll take it. So Bingley might have got taken for a ride. So in one sentence, Netherfield Park is let at last. She's telling us some important things about what society is like there. Throws a little shadow on Mr. Bennet's kind of lack of interest in his estate. Longbourn could go the way of Netherfield Park, where the family has to leave it and go live someplace cheaper, as happened in Persuasion. And then let's look at what happened then. Bingley took Netherfield Park and he went off to London to gather a whole big party of men and women to come and have a house party with him. Jane Austen goes to the trouble of telling us that everyone understands that he's going to collect a big party, but he comes back with just his family and Darcy. Now, we've all known this story forever. Have you ever thought about what that means, that he came with just his family and Darcy? I sure didn't for a long time. But stop and think. Put yourself in Regency mindset. Darcy's the nephew of an earl. He's unmarried. He has £10,000 a year. Yes, he offends people a lot, but he is a prize in the marriage mart. Where do people go in the fall? They go to hunt and they go to house parties. Sorry, I'm trying to get the slide to advance here. Got here a Victorian view, actually, of a Regency house party and hunting. This is where Darcy should be. It's very, very odd, actually, that he would go to Netherfield Park with just Bingley and his family in the fall, when he should be in much higher society. He should be in demand for that, and he really ought to be following up on those connections, because he has a sister coming out in a couple of years. He's going to need those connections for her. He's really letting her down if he expects her to have a come out by going to Netherfield Park. So by the time of the Maraton Assembly, by the time they see Darcy, the people of Maraton and also the Regency readers already have a clue that there's something not quite right about this situation. Darcy shouldn't be there in a place like this. He clearly doesn't like the neighborhood. He's not interested in Netherfield. He doesn't seem to enjoy Bingley's sister's company that much. Why is he there? What's going on? So the Regency reader, without all the windows that we look through, sees something going on here. And later on, when the letter comes and we find out about Georgiana's elopement, that's a complete shock to us that there's something wrong with Darcy's family. It wouldn't have been a shock to the Regency reader. So, another thing that's hidden in plain sight. My first copy of Pride and Prejudice was a paperback that I just loved to pieces, literally to pieces. It has fallen apart because I read it so often. But in the back, there was a afterword that I read very carefully again and again and sort of memorized every fact in it. And it started out with how Jane Austen didn't ever talk about the war because she was only interested in her little village and she didn't talk anything about the war. Well, militia, hidden in plain sight. In England, in the militia didn't exist most of the time. The militia was only embodied, was only called up in times of war and when there was fear of invasion. Jane Austen doesn't need to tell her Regency audience that, and so we don't hear it. But the very fact that the militia is in Maraton says this is a time of war. There's a danger of invasion of England by France. The danger isn't the same as it was in 1805 when Napoleon's invasion was imminent, but there is still a danger. So I bring this out. That's one of the things hidden in plain sight, that Pride and Prejudice is a war novel. Now I'm going to go on to another place where we have to pay close attention to Jane Austen's words, the Maraton Assembly. Lots of you have read lots of Jane Austen fan fiction. And one of the big questions is, did Darcy mean Elizabeth to overhear him when he delivers his great set down of "she is tolerable, I suppose"? Why is this a question? Because Jane Austen tells us very clearly that it's not a question. This is what the text says. Darcy says, "Which did you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, detail, you got to pay attention to the details, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me," etc. He deliberately caught her eye before delivering her set down. He wanted her to hear it. Now, before you start thinking bad things about Darcy there, let's just go into his head. He's here in this country town where everyone knows he's got 10,000 pounds a year. Every girl has his eye on him. He's sort of willing to dance to please Bingley, and he looks over and sees Elizabeth, who smiles at him because she wants to dance. But what does Darcy see? He sees a fortune hunter who wants him to dance with her so that she can charm him and make him fall in love and entrap him into marrying her. So he delivers a set down. It doesn't mean that he thinks she's only tolerable. He's saying, smiling at me, stay in your place. I'm not marrying you. Might seem like a bit of a leap, but it was what's going on there. Some of the things I discovered for looking at places where Jane Austen's text gave us clues that something was important was going on was when I took part in Group Blog's Pride and Prejudice 200 project. We wrote this several years ago, exactly 200 years after the action of Pride and Prejudice, and we wrote it in real time over the course of the year plus of the action of Pride and Prejudice. We wrote missing scenes, like the one some of you saw last night, the gardeners just talking together after visiting Pemberley. It's a scene Jane Austen didn't write. Shannon Winslow wrote it, and we all enjoyed it. But we wrote missing scenes. We also wrote scenes from different points of view. And we eventually put them together in a book, Pride and Prejudice Behind the Scenes, which is still available for sale. It has many different authors in it, and all the proceeds from it go to supporting Jane Austen's House Museum. We've given them about $12,000 in royalties from this book so far, and hope to keep doing so for many years. But one of the scenes that I was assigned for this was Elizabeth's first meeting with Wickham from Wickham's point of view. And I thought this would be pretty simple, until I sat down there and actually read Jane Austen's text for it. And then it became very very, very confusing. But once I walked it through, it put a whole new light on Pride and Prejudice for me. Because up until that time, if you'd asked me what the greatest flaw in Pride and Prejudice was, I would have said it was Jane Austen's reliance on coincidence. The coincidence of Wickham showing up, the coincidence of Wickham being interested in Elizabeth, the same woman Darcy was, that she would be the only one he'd tell, the coincidence that later he would elope with Lydia, and this whole chain of coincidences around Wickham. I thought that was a little bit of cheating, but it's Jane Austen, so that was okay. But doing textual analysis on this scene showed me that it wasn't at all a coincidence that Wickham targeted Elizabeth, who is not his type. We know who Wickham's type is. 15 years old, 16 years old, not very smart, very impressed with a red coat. Not Elizabeth. Why did he first set on Elizabeth? So let's look at that first meeting. If you recall, the Bennet girls and Mr. Collins walk to Maraton together, and they spot Mr. Denny and a handsome, most gentlemanlike fellow with him. And since Lydia and Kitty are really there just to see the officers, they want to meet this man. And Jane Austen tells us, the officer was the very Mr. Denny concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck by the stranger's air, all wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined to find out, led the way across the street under the pretense of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Did you hear all that detail? This is an inordinate amount of detail for Jane Austen. So to try and explain what goes on here, I put together this series of slides. So we've got here Maraton, which is in this case Laycock Village, which was used in 1995, Pride and Prejudice. Longbourn is this direction. Netherfield is this direction. And the Bennet sisters are walking in from Longbourn. Now for writing this scene with Wickham, I had to figure out exactly where everyone stood so that I would know what Wickham was looking at. There's too many characters in this, so I ended up with a whole lot of chess pieces and spoons representing different people, but I hope this will work out. So the Bennet women are walking into Maraton, and now we know that from Jane Austen that the officers are coming the other direction down the street. And the Bennet women cross the street to look in the other direction. And then the two gentlemen, remember, they turned back and had reached the same spot. So then they talk. We've got the gentlemen, sorry, my Photoshop skills weren't good enough to put everyone together, but we've got the Bennet ladies here talking to Wickham and Denny over here. So we know that the gentlemen were facing that way and are now facing towards Netherfield. Got it? So then Jane Austen has them talk, and then she says, and the whole party were still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew their notice and Darcy and Bingley were riding down the street. And just in case we were missing it, Jane Austen makes a point of telling us that they were going from Netherfield to Longbourn to check on Jane's health. So they're coming from over here and they're riding into town. The Bennet ladies are between them and Wickham and Denny. And then on distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly toward them and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman and Miss Bennet the principal object. Remember, these two gentlemen are behind the ladies. He was then, Bingley said, on his way to Longbourn on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger. So she also tells us he is looking at Elizabeth until he decides he's not going to look at Elizabeth, and then he looks up and sees Wickham. Now stop and think again. We've got Bingley and Darcy riding in this way. We've got the Bennet ladies standing here, and behind them are these two. During this time of discussion between Bingley and Darcy and the ladies, what is Wickham seeing? He is seeing Darcy look at Elizabeth. Before anything else happens, Wickham, who knows Darcy very well, has seen Darcy staring at Elizabeth, and he has figured out Darcy is interested. So naturally, he wants to pour some poison in Elizabeth's ear. He knows that Elizabeth is interested, that Darcy is interested in Elizabeth, and he wants to throw a monkey wrench in it. No real reason, he just wants to make trouble for Darcy. That is why he targets Elizabeth. So that coincidence number one isn't a coincidence at all, and the text is there telling us. It's just that we all skip over that stuff because there's so much stage direction in there, much more than Jane Austen usually uses. And I said that once I thought about this, I did realize some of the other coincidences aren't coincidences either, because we know about Wickham's elopement with Lydia. Why did he choose Lydia? Well, Lydia was in Brighton with him, no doubt flirting with him. And probably at some point he asked about her family. And what would she have said? Well, Lizzie was supposed to go to the Lake District, but instead she's going to Derbyshire. And Elizabeth, after her visit to Rosings, had already told Wickham that she had changed her opinion on Darcy. He knew that. And now she's going to Derbyshire unexpectedly. He thinks they're going to get married. He thinks the coincidence of them going to Derbyshire is something bigger than it is. So suddenly Lydia is a valuable person. I'm sorry, I'm being photobombed by a cat back here. So it's not coincidence that he targeted Lydia, or that he didn't make a whole lot of effort to hide in London, because he knew Lydia was his meal ticket for life. So is that coincidence uncoincidenced again. Another place the text tells us something that I think maybe modern readers miss is when we're at Netherfield and Elizabeth is staying at Netherfield, and Miss Bingley invites her for a turn about the room to refresh her. And Miss Bingley invites Darcy to join their party walking about the room. He was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, and with either of which motives his joining them would interfere. What could he mean? She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could understand him. And then there's a little byplay there, and Darcy says, "I've not the smallest objection to explaining them," said he as soon as she allowed him to speak. "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. If it is the first, I should be completely in your way, and if the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire." You might think that's not very important, but Jane Austen gave us an important stage direction there. Darcy is sitting by the fire. The fireplace in an English country house is on an interior wall, which means they're walking between him and the windows. If you know your English costuming, you may be aware that Regency dresses were designed to be translucent in the skirts. This was not an accident. If you look at Elizabeth's legs here, this is how they were designed to be, and the costume designer of Pride and Prejudice made a point of making sure that the dresses were translucent, as was fashionable. So Darcy, sitting by the fire, is saying he's planning to look at them walk up and down the room between him and the windows, where he will get a nice view of their bodies. So Caroline Bingley isn't being so odd when she says shocking, shocking, shocking. But we don't really realize quite how shocking it is what he said. Darcy can be very proper, but only when he wants to, and this is not one of those moments when he wants to. Okay, and now I'm going to get into kind of a bigger question, which will lead back into what Darcy was doing at Netherfield, going to Netherfield instead of the sort of place he should have been. Bingley and Georgiana. Another great debate that happens a lot in Jane Austen fan fiction, including some of my own early works, is whether Darcy really had any interest in Bingley marrying Georgiana. Well, the problem is when you go to the text, it turns out that he does. Jane Austen tells us this very directly, but in language that's very difficult for a modern audience to comprehend. Over history, writers have been using shorter and shorter sentences as time goes on. You're probably well aware Jane Austen uses much longer sentences than modern writers. She also indulges in what I sometimes call pronoun abuse, which was very much the thing then. But this particular bit of text comes up when they're at Pemberley. And Miss Bingley has just said her bit about implying Wickham being a favorite of the family to try and embarrass Elizabeth. But Jane Austen points out that Miss Bingley does not know that Wickham is an embarrassment to Miss Darcy. And she tells us not a syllable had ever reached her, Miss Bingley, of Miss Darcy's meditated elopement. To no creature had it been revealed where secrecy was possible, except to Elizabeth. And from all Bingley's connections, her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it from that very wish which Elizabeth had long attributed to him of their becoming hereafter her own. He had certainly formed such a plan, and without meaning that it should affect his endeavor to separate him from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it added something to his lively concern for the welfare of his friend. Confused yet? We've got way too many pronouns here that refer back too many hims and hers, and it doesn't make sense. So just to make it clearer, I've gone through and I've replaced all the pronouns here with who they are. From all Bingley's connections, Darcy was particularly anxious to conceal Georgiana's elopement from that very wish which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to Darcy of Bingley's family becoming hereafter Georgiana's own, which is to say, Darcy wanted Bingley to marry Georgiana. Darcy had certainly formed such a plan. There you have it. Jane Austen said so. And without meaning that it should affect Darcy's endeavor to separate Bingley from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it might add something to Darcy's lively concern for the welfare of Bingley. So she tells us directly, not only does Darcy want Bingley to marry Georgiana, but it also had something to do with why he wanted to separate him from Jane Bennet. Now there's the big question. Why would Darcy want Georgiana to marry Bingley? Bingley is well below them in class, well below in fortune. Georgiana is the niece of an earl. She has 30,000 pounds. She's a very good catch. Bingley's a terrible match for her. And she's only 16. We all know what a girl like Georgiana should be looking forward to. She should be having a come out in a couple of years, making her curtsy to the Queen, and going to all these balls and meeting the most eligible young men and then marrying one of them. Why is Darcy, long before she's ready for her season, trying to marry her off to someone who's beneath her? This is something that a Regency reader would not miss at all. It tells us something. It tells us there is something wrong with Georgiana, and that for some reason, Darcy does not dare to allow her to have a season. So what is it? Why is Darcy trying to get Georgiana married off before she can go into public? Well, we know about Wickham. There's a number of things going on there. One of the big ones is that Wickham may be planning to blackmail them at that point. Wickham is still alive. He could spread rumors about Georgiana if she has a season. Darcy may feel that it's not safe to have a season because Wickham could come out and ruin things for them. So he might want to marry her to Bingley or anyone before having a season. But again, Bingley is going down a fair ways. Now, what I'm going to say may be upsetting to some of you. I am not saying anything negative about Georgiana, but all the evidence in the text suggests that Wickham succeeded in seducing Georgiana. I'm not saying that Georgiana was easy or anything else. She was a complete setup and she had no way out of it. And trigger warning, we don't even know whether she consented. But Georgiana Darcy is not Lydia Bennet. Georgiana Darcy went to a finishing school for girls. She would not have been taught anything about men, but she would have been taught a lot of important things about society, including that elopement would ruin her. Not only ruin her family. Running off to get married was extremely scandalous. She would know that by eloping with Wickham, she would be hurting Darcy. She would be hurting Darcy's children if he ever has them, his marital prospects, would be harmed. His ability to move in society would be harmed. I personally can't believe that Georgiana Darcy, 15 years old, looking up to her brother as a father, would have agreed to an elopement that would do so much damage to him if she felt she had any other choice in the world. So to me, that tells me she thinks she doesn't have a choice. And unless she thinks she is already ruined, I can't imagine what that would be. Again, let me say, I'm not saying anything negative about Georgiana or her morals. She's 15 years old. She knows nothing about how men work. She's been very protected from them, like every woman. She's never been allowed to go any place alone. She has a companion who is supposed to do nothing but warn her and keep her safe from men. Wickham is a trained seducer. He has spent all of his adult life learning how to seduce young women. He's very, very good at it. And the person who's supposed to be protecting her, Mrs. Young, is presumably there saying, oh, it's all right if he touches your arm, he loves you. It's all right if he kisses you, he loves you. Georgiana is depending on Mrs. Young, and Mrs. Young is saying, go ahead, it's perfectly fine. And suddenly perfectly fine turns into just too late. And Georgiana is in a terrible dilemma. So she has really no choice but to agree to elope with Mr. Wickham. It's even possible she thinks she's pregnant. And when I was writing Mr. Darcy's Obsession, one of the variations I made in it was that I decided I would make Georgiana have a baby by Wickham that would be given away for adoption. And I went through the book to discover if there was anything that would contradict this. The only thing that contradicts it is that Caroline Bingley says at one point in the letter that Bingley had seen Georgiana. We don't know if that's true or whether that she was just saying that to scare Jane Bennet away. But what we do have is the first introduction of Georgiana Darcy. Miss Darcy was tall and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed and her appearance womanly and graceful. Womanly. Now that's an adjective that Jane Austen doesn't use anywhere else. This is a hint. Jane Austen doesn't tell us about women's figures. We know that Elizabeth's has some lacking in symmetry, but again, she's telling us something by the fact that she's describing it. I think it's a suggestion that Georgiana may have had a child, that it could be that Darcy, after the summer in Ramsgate, had her go someplace safe to have her child. But we know that, remember what I was saying about it's really odd that Darcy would show up at Netherfield with Bingley and not at a house party or something like that? All of a sudden it makes sense why he'd be very interested in securing Bingley as a husband for Georgiana, doesn't it? Bingley's not in a position to complain because he is so much lower. And Darcy is going out of his way to basically court and groom Bingley as a husband for Georgiana. First he goes with him to Netherfield, then he invites him to Pemberley. I mean, doesn't this man have any other friends? He's spending all this time on Bingley and Georgiana. And what I'm suggesting to you is that I think Jane Austen's Regency readers would have seen this, seen right away that there was a problem around Darcy, and seen that Georgiana was ruined and that was why she had to be married off to Bingley. It's a subplot that for us has gotten subsumed in the bigger Elizabeth and Darcy plot, but it's definitely there. And now, with everything that's been going on in the world in the last few weeks, I think there's one thing that's hidden in plain sight in Pride and Prejudice that I really do have to talk about. And that is the question of race in Jane Austen's time. Oops, that wasn't supposed to be the one that came up. Okay. So many of you have probably seen Sanditon, and we're probably kind of surprised that Jane Austen had a half-black character there. because we've all seen this very whitewashed Regency that comes up in all the videos and movies and miniseries that we've seen. It wasn't actually like that. England was predominantly white then, but not completely. There were, at the time Pride and Prejudice took place, there were about 20,000 Blacks living in England, and presumably much larger number of East Indians. We don't have any way of counting those, but we know that there were a lot of Blacks. We don't know how many there would be in Hampshire, where Jane Austen would have seen them on a day-to-day basis, but we know there were plenty in London where she visited. And the race question was seen very differently at that time. Until about the 1780s, people who were Black or Indian were seen in England as foreigners. Foreigners are bad in England. So I'm not saying they like them, but it wasn't primarily about their race, it was about them being foreign. In around the 1870s and 80s, an abolition movement started. Up until then, there'd been a lot, slavery had been just a fact of life throughout much of the world. It had nothing to do with race for the most part. English sailors were frequently taken as slaves. This is why the Royal Navy did not like supporting slavery, the slave trade. Barbary pirates came up to the south coast of England and would capture English people to take off and sell as slaves. It wasn't necessarily a race-based thing at all. But when the abolition movement started, there became a movement by slave owners which tried to establish that, okay, maybe slavery isn't a good thing, but Black people are different from us. And they started establishing that Black people needed to be slaves because they needed us to take care of them. This was in Jane Austen's lifetime, but she might or might not have been affected by it. But what I'm going to show you now is some of the evidence we have about people of different races in England at that time, despite the whitewashed movies that you've seen. Here we have Ignatius Sancho in a painting by no less than Gainsborough in 1768. Whoops, sorry, I'm messing up here. These, I'm going to give you some people of color who were moving in the highest circles. He was born on a slave ship. He became a protege of the Duke of Montagu, who encouraged his education. He became the butler to the Duchess of Montagu. He wrote plays. He wrote to Lawrence Sterne and was quite a correspondent of him. Lawrence Sterne and Tristram Shandy, you might remember there's some Black characters there. And he later opened a shop which attracted many prominent admirers. Now with my out of order slides, I'm going to go back. Right. Here we have some of the people of color in England. I think many of you are familiar with the story of Dido Bell, great niece of Lord Mansfield. Here we have one of the ways that Black servants were used. They were used as pages to the wealthy. And over here we have Joseph Emety, who was the leader of the Truro Philharmonic and one of the top musicians of the era. The biggest concert promoter of England, who promoted Haydn, wanted to promote him but felt that his skin color might get in the way, but his musical ability was certainly not an issue. Phyllis Wheatley, I put in because she's female and I want to make the point that females could do this too. She was actually an American. She was born in Africa, brought to America as a slave, lived in Boston, but she became a poet and she wrote some very nice poetry, but couldn't publish it in the US. So she was taken by her master's son to London in 1773 to get her book published, which it was. And she was quite celebrated by high society. It was quite the thing to be able to have a chance to meet Phyllis Wheatley. Here's another one. Oh gosh, I never thought about it having to pronounce his name. Olaudah Equiano? I have no idea. Anyway, he was an explorer, a merchant, and he wrote this autobiography that was very, very popular about his life. And going back to the character in Sanditon, one of the things I discovered when I looked at this was a book that Jane Austen might well have read that came out in 1808, and I think you might be interested in it. It was called The Woman of Color, and it was a story about a Black heiress's life immediately after the abolition of the British slave trade. Olivia Fairfield, the biracial heroine and orphaned daughter of a slaveholder, must travel from Jamaica to England, and as a condition of her father's will, either marry her Caucasian first cousin or become dependent on his mercenary elder brother. As Olivia decides between these two conflicting possibilities, her letters recount her impressions of Britain and its inhabitants as only a Black woman could record them. Interesting that Jane Austen would, only a few years later, write a story with a character with some strong similarities to this. And The Woman of Color was also a very popular book at the time. And I just want to reinforce that I'm talking here about Blacks. However, the most common people of color in England then would have been East Indians and what were called Mohammedans. And there's actually some descriptions of the London Stock Exchange about how common it was to see Mohammedans on the stock exchange. London was more cosmopolitan than we think. So now I'm going to just finish up with a little bit of information about the abolition movement, because Jane Austen, it affected Jane Austen, and I ended up researching some of this because there's some abolitionists in my next book, which will be coming out. Jane Austen's father was actually the trustee of an Antigua plantation. A little bit of a shock there, I know. Some people think that's where Jane Austen got her information for the Antigua element in Mansfield Park. But she clearly would have known something about the conditions because of that. But Jane Austen, all evidence is that she was an abolitionist. She greatly admired the writings of Quaker abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. In one of her letters, she facetiously declares herself in love with him. And she not only read his history of the rise, progress, and accomplishment of the abolition of the African slave trade, but she borrowed a name from it, Norris. Mrs. Norris may well be named after the evil slaveholder Norris in that book. So we also know that her beloved brother, Francis Austen, intercepted a slaver in Caribbean water, and his letters report disgust and revulsion, not only for the slave trade itself, but the entire slave system. So we also know Jane Austen was exposed to abolitionist ideas, in addition to what many of you may know, that many people think that there's a lot of abolition undercurrents in Mansfield Park. So a little bit about the abolition movement in England. It started around 1760, basically working towards the abolishment of all slaves. This was a design put together by Josiah Wedgwood and by Not a Man and a Brother. It was put on many things, and this actually was something that really appealed to a lot of English people, and they really felt it very strongly. Over time, there was more and more information coming out, and it became very popular to be abolitionist and anti-slavery. This is a Wedgwood teapot from circa 1760. It says, "Health to the sick, honor to the brave, success to the lover, and freedom to the slave." You weren't expecting that, were you? That is just showing you how popular it was. The thing that made slavery in the West Indies so profitable was sugar. Sugar had become very popular in England at this time, and in the 1780s, a sugar boycott was organized, and it became quite the thing. At its height, there were about 300,000 families participating in the boycott, and that includes the royal family of England. And you can still see sugar bowls and sugar containers that say East India sugar not made by slaves, so that you could put a sugar bowl on your tea tray and assure your guests that they were not eating sugar made by slavery. This was a big deal socially. So this was another thing that was going on in plain sight. Jane Austen didn't have to write about this. She was writing for people who lived in her time. They knew all of these things. She didn't have to describe people of color. Her audience knew they existed. So it wasn't that she was ignoring it, it was just there. I know this, having written modern novels myself. I don't tell people about 9/11 in my modern novels. I assume they know it. So there are some interesting things to think about when you're next watching a Jane Austen movie and everyone in the background is white. Think about it, that it didn't actually look like that. That there was nothing to today, but still a substantial population of color in England then. And Jane Austen was concerned about the slavery. So here we are, I've presented you with some kind of shocking ideas about what could have been going on in the backstory of Pride and Prejudice with Georgiana and Wickham. And now we can finally leave Netherfield Park and I can come back and hear your questions. If anyone has any. Any questions?
Yes, Abigail, I have a question.
Yes.
Do you think that Wickham was actually, that Jane Austen was showing that Wickham was following Darcy around by showing up in Maraton?
There isn't any evidence of that in the text that I can find, but it is clear that Wickham just sort of showed up out of the blue. So that may have been coincidence, or who knows? Wickham might have been following him to try and put in a little bit more blackmail about Georgiana.
Okay, thank you.
Abigail?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Victoria.
Yeah, so I was wondering, did you figure all of that stuff out about Pride and Prejudice on your own, or were there resources, research that you did that helped you figure all of that out?
Well, here's the embarrassing part. I figured most of it out on my own and was terribly proud of myself, and then found out that scholars knew it all along. And boy, was that embarrassing. But Victoria, you were there when I delivered part of this lecture and some other things in November. You might have noticed that I didn't talk about the part about Netherfield Park being let at last and what that had meant and Darcy being there. But if you look back at that, you discover there's a moment when I'm delivering that lecture and I suddenly stop short for about half a minute because it has suddenly hit me why Darcy is there.
Oh.
And I was afraid to start saying this in the middle of a lecture when I hadn't thought it through. But that was when I realized that was right when I was in the middle of delivering that lecture. And I suddenly thought, oh, there's the missing piece. I've got it now. And yet again, when I talked to scholar friends, they were like, oh yeah, we know that. Well, it was interesting for me. Arnie, did you have a question?
Oh, yes, I did. Thank you. First of all, as we were talking beforehand, great minds think alike, because I have felt for a long time, for slightly different reasons, the womanly part was a lovely pickup on your part about Georgiana having already been experienced. But there's a loose end that I thought about for a long time, and then I came up with an answer, which is the loose end is what happened to her baby. And the reason I have an idea about that is because you're probably aware I have a reading of Emma, an alternative reading of Emma under which Jane Fairfax has been pregnant. And what happens to her baby? Well, I concluded a long time ago that she gives that baby to Mrs. Weston, which explains why Mrs. Weston suddenly appears to be pregnant out of nowhere and has a baby. Well, the same thing sort of happens in Pride and Prejudice, if you think about it, because who has a baby? It's off stage. It's only in passing that we find out about it. But who has a baby? Charlotte has a baby. And one of the anomalies, one of the questions that people ask about Pride and Prejudice is how in the world could she do it with Mr. Collins? It's like, ugh, kind of factor. Well, what if it's not her baby? What if she never did have to do it with him and it's Georgiana's baby? So anyway, wonderful talk you've given and many interesting ideas. And so as I was saying, I knew you couldn't shock me about Georgiana because on that one, I was thinking the same lines.
Thank you. Interesting theory. So, other questions? Because I have to stay in speaker view for the effect on YouTube, I can't see it if someone's waving their hand or something. So please speak up or put something in chat if you've got a question, or if you just want to throw rotten vegetables and tell me that I should never allow my brain to work in such ways again.
Hi, I've always thought that the thinnest part of the plot was where Darcy says to Elizabeth, "Oh, I didn't want Bingley and Jane to get together because she smiles too much," and it just made no sense to me. But the fact that this other motive may exist makes a great deal more sense. But it also means that he's lying in his letter.
Yeah.
And so, which gives a whole different turn to how reliable he is. And he's such a Boy Scout in so many ways. But maybe he is does have a hidden agenda. At any rate, I really think it's an interesting, and I too was struck by why is she womanly when I first read it. That it seemed very odd to me.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things I always wondered was why it took him so long to tell Bingley that he learned that Jane actually liked him, right? Because Elizabeth tells him that at Hunsford, and then apparently he never tells Bingley. And and I always wondered why it took him so long, but if he wants Bingley to marry Georgiana, that makes sense.
Yes, because he's put a lot of time into grooming Bingley for this, and he's giving something up there.
Yeah.
I always took Georgiana being womanly as just being buxom, perhaps buxom. And when it comes to Charlotte maybe having taken Georgiana's baby, that might be plausible to me, except for the fact that I don't think Darcy could have ever accepted that Collins would have raised Georgiana's baby.
I think I have to agree with that. I wanted to say the same thing, that on another aspect, that I don't think Darcy would trust Mr. Collins not to spill the beans, not to betray the secret.
That's a good question. And Mr. Darcy's obsession, where I had Georgiana have a baby, Darcy farmed it out to one of his cousins to adopt, a distant cousin, and explained that it was, and implied that it was his byblow, and didn't allow Georgiana's name to come into it at all. But that's all purely theoretical. The whole womanly question about being buxom, again, the reason it's important is that Jane Austen doesn't usually tell us those things unless she wants us to pick something up from it. That's why I think it's worthy of attention.
But could it be that she comments on it because even though Wickham's primary goal in seducing her was to get to her £30,000 dowry, he would be more attracted to her because she was more womanly than other 15-year-olds. I mean, we all know that some 15-year-olds look like boys and some 15-year-olds look like 20-year-olds.
Exactly.
He mentions it, so Wickham would not only have the advantage of seducing his enemy's sister for her money, but also enjoy the company of this buxom young girl.
Well, certainly that might have been it, but I'm not sure she would have bothered to tell us that because I don't think Wickham needed that incentive at all. I
Yeah,
think
well,
he would have gone
it's
for
an
her anyway. But it
attraction,
actually,
yeah.
I do have to say that it was unusual at the time. The age of menarche at that point was around 16. Women were not well nourished. 15-year-olds were much more likely to look like boys than girls then. So yes, no, there's no way of knowing exactly what she meant by it, but the fact that she gave us a hint, I find it hard to believe that Wickham wouldn't have gone after Georgiana even if she had looked like a complete boy.
Right.
So
Probably.
30,000 pounds is a lot of money. So
Yeah.
Another hidden thing I think that Regency era readers would have found funny is when Lady Catherine says, "Had I ever learnt, I would have been a true proficient." And I always thought that meant, of course she learnt. Of course they tried to teach her to play piano and she couldn't do it. So and Regency era writers would know that she had been given every chance to learn to do everything, but she was useless and she couldn't do it. So, you know, she pretends that she was never taught. So I always thought that was sort of an inside Regency era joke that readers would chuckle about. And people don't get necessarily nowadays, because I see sometimes people ask, well, why wouldn't she know how to play? Well, they did try to teach her. She just couldn't do it. That was always one of the sort of things I thought Regency readers would find funny. And the other thing I was thinking about the Netherfield thing is that I always thought that perhaps the heir to Netherfield had died in the war. There seems to be a real lack of young men in the area. I mean, the Bennets have 5 beautiful daughters. No one's been interested in Jane since she was 16 and some young man wrote her some poetry. Yet they dine with 5 and 20 families, Mrs. Bennet says. So where are all the young men to go along with those families?
well, you're right on 2 fronts there. There was a shortage of young men because of the wars. Definitely, there was a shortage of young men. But Jane Austen went to great trouble to make Elizabeth a really bad marital prospect. With 5 daughters, that means no brothers. Unlike Jane Austen herself, there's no brothers who will support her after her father's death. Anyone who marries one of the Bennet girls is marrying the entire family. If a man marries Jane, he is taking on supporting 4 sisters and the mother after Mr. Bennet's death for the rest of his life. And they're kind of difficult and scandalous. Takes a whole lot more than beauty to make you willing to take that on, to take on all of that family into your house. So it's not just a shortage of men. Any sensible man is going to steer clear of the Bennet girls because of what the future holds for the one man who marries one of them.
Oh yeah, I never really thought of that angle.
So when Elizabeth refuses to marry Mr. Collins, she's being extremely brave because her prospects are very bad. So, and as to your point about Lady Catherine not being able to learn, I think you're quite correct. Obviously, if she's able to marry and host parties and have a baby, she's perfectly capable of sitting at a piano and moving her fingers. It's not that hard. Other questions? Arnie.
Just to quickly respond to the ingenious, I think it was Veronica, who had commented about the baby and Mr. Collins being an unreliable person to keep a secret. Well, if it was a boy, I mean, correct anyone here who knows the entail rules better than I, if he had a boy, would that boy not inherit Longbourn
Yes,
when he died? And if so,
true.
that's a pretty compelling reason never to reveal that the boy is not his own.
Yeah.
And Charlotte, for that matter, as well. They would both have a strong, especially if neither of them was particularly interested in creating children themselves, because neither of them is interested in the other one in that way. It's a perfect, it takes care of Georgiana's problem, takes care of their problem. That's the best deal, is when you don't need to enforce it with a hammer, but it's self-interest that keeps people doing it.
Well, actually, I wanted to disagree with you on that score as well, because
Go ahead.
I think they led a celibate marriage or something like that. And if there was a child later on, and then it was that Mr. Collins loses the possibility of giving the inheritance to his own child.
Could be, but again, if he's not interested in women, and if Charlotte is not interested in men, then it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen.
Kind of a extreme theory, I think. Not being interested in.
And I've just been texted a question from YouTube from someone who wants to know how the abolitionist part plays out in my current book. Well, anyone who's seen the sneak previews of it knows that the shock at the beginning is that Darcy's estranged younger brother is actually engaged to Elizabeth. The way the abolitionist part plays out, and it's not a major part of the book, it's just in the background, is that Darcy's brother is an abolitionist. And that was the reason that his father disowned him, because Pemberley at that time got some of its money from a slave plantation that they owned, similar to the situation in Mansfield Park, and many, many other aristocratic and rich families in England. The truth of the matter is, you go and see those beautiful houses that I love to go see, most of them were built on slave money. It's just what it was. Anyway, so the story is that Darcy's father disowned Andrew for his strong abolitionist sentiments, and he was sent off, and he went off to London, where he worked with William Wilberforce on passing the abolition of the slave trade bill. And it isn't until after old Mr. Darcy dies that Darcy, who, have to put this in, Darcy freed the slaves immediately on inheriting. Darcy is not taking money from slavery. Darcy reaches out to Andrew to try to mend the breach, and he offers him living at Kimpton and discovers that Andrew is engaged to Elizabeth. Okay, now you know why it's a really high angst book, right? Don't worry, there's a happy ending for Darcy and Elizabeth, and the abolitionists come out of it pretty well too. So the abolitionism remains in the background because abolitionist characters come in and out. But like I said, it's primarily a Darcy and Elizabeth story. I always put the history in the background. So.
When was slavery abolished in Great Britain?
Okay, complicated question. It's not that simple. There was slavery in Great Britain. There were a couple of court cases in the 18th century, including the one from Lord Mansfield, that basically ended up determining that the heir of England was inconsistent with slavery, which meant any slave who set foot in England was free. And that was Lord Mansfield's decision in 1770. Anyone got the number off the top of their head? Sorry. So at that point, there was no slavery in England, but there were still English slave ships, the backbone of the slave trade. Couldn't have a slave in England, but you could go to Africa, enslave someone, take them to America and sell them. That was fine. It wasn't until 1808 that the slave trade was abolished, and then you could no longer do the shipping. But that did not get rid of slavery. That wasn't until 1832 that the slaves in the colonies were freed. So it was a long, complicated process. the abolishing of the slave trade was an intermediate stage because Wilberforce, who really sort of led the movement, realized early on that he could not get rid of slavery flat out, that he needed to take it one step at a time. But stopping the slave trade was an enormous deal.
Yeah, thank you.
When can we expect it? The release?
The release, hopefully late summer. It's hard to tell. It's mostly done, but things keep getting in the way. And as I was telling someone before this started, this wasn't the best year to decide to write a high angst book. It's been a challenge to keep working on it when the world's a little angsty too. So it slowed me down some, but it's mostly written at this point. I'm filling out the remainder of the first draft, and then it will go out for edits. So
Look forward to it.
thank you.
Abigail, are you the one who told us the story about the cucumbers, the cucumber salad in Pride and Prejudice as well?
Yes, I am. And actually, that was just something that I cut out of this. This was another point. And I don't have the exact quotes here for you. When Elizabeth and Jane are returning from London after Elizabeth's visit to Rosings, they meet Lydia and Kitty at an inn, and Kitty and Lydia have purchased lunch for them. And when they arrive, the lunch is laid out, and Kitty and Lydia are dressing a salad with cucumber. Again, you're just got to pick up, why is Jane Austen telling us that there's a cucumber here? She doesn't give us these details. Well, there's two things. One is cucumbers are pretty new to England at that point, and fashionable. So Lydia and Kitty have ordered a fashionable lunch for them. But remember, when was Elizabeth at Rosings? She was there at Easter. So we're a short time after Easter. Anyone in England here ever produce cucumbers in their garden a few weeks after Easter? No. These are hothouse cucumbers, which are enormously expensive. So Lydia and Kitty have ordered this aristocratic, extremely expensive luncheon, and then told Jane and Elizabeth that they're paying for it. It was really sort of a nasty twist to do. Oh, and I see that I really do have a photo bomber here, don't I? So that is Pfeffernuss there behind me. So she helps me with lots of my stories too. Other questions?
So I'll jump in. So back to the thing about Georgiana possibly having a baby. This is why it doesn't work for me. And that is that I don't think the timing works out. Because if she, say she was in Ramsgate somewhere in the middle of the summer, she would probably have been delivering that baby around April-ish, which would have been right around Easter, which would have been when Darcy was at Rosings, like flirting with Elizabeth and trying to propose. I think he would have been involved, even if he sent her to Scotland or somewhere to have the baby. I just don't think he would be going about his life if she was having a child, and I feel like he would be in some way involved. So I don't know.
Well, I hear your point, but at the same time, his key goal then would be to distract from Georgiana's absence.
True.
He's a big distraction not being with her. If he goes to see her, then people's attention goes there because he's an unmarried man with 10,000 pounds. People are always looking at what he's doing, and he doesn't want them looking at Georgiana.
Yeah, but even if he wasn't with her, don't you think he would, I don't know, he just seems too cavalier and carefree at that time to me.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, but right after this whole seduction elopement thing, what does he do? He leaves her alone and goes off to Netherfield.
Which is another thing that doesn't really make sense.
Yes, unless he's trying to distract from her absence. So
Possible. But it's also possible that she did get seduced, that she was pregnant and lost the baby, or any number of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The timing of that's always sort of been open to me to interpretation. When exactly was she in Ramsgate? When exactly did this near elopement happen? You know, how much later was he actually at Netherfield? Was it the next month? Was it a couple of months? Which can make a difference, I suppose. In Pride and Prejudice, I just want your opinion on this. Jane Austen does describe Lydia and calls her a stout, I've lost it now, it's in chapter 9, sort of a stout, well-formed girl, which to me has always drawn some comparison to her later description of Georgiana as being womanly. So I've always sort of made this connection between both of them being the same age and both of them appearing older than other girls their age would have. And we know George Wickham likes them young, and you mentioned that as well. So I wonder if, well, that's often been my interpretation of it, not necessarily that she was hinting that Georgiana had a baby, but that, like Lydia, she appeared more womanly because she happens to have been one of those early bloomers. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a valid point. It could also have been her way of explaining why Lydia is out at an age where girls shouldn't be out. That most girls at 16, there had been
Mrs.
nothing to do that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and they wouldn't have been wanting to flirt with boys. So it's hard to say.
Yeah.
We're trying to read in between the lines here, but
Mhm.
you're absolutely right that she does describe Lydia in similar terms.
Mhm.
So.
I just wanted to say one more thing about the time line question, that at that time you would not discover pregnancy so early as we would in our time. So maybe they are only completely sure when the baby quickens. So it could be that it was very early summer then all this happened, and in late September Darcy may have been sure, and it may be a few before, may have had, the Georgiana may have had a baby before he goes to Rosings at Easter.
Yes, that's a very good point, that they don't know as early then. But we don't know. All Georgiana would have known at the time was that she could have been pregnant.
And anyway, if she's not pregnant, she's ruined if she's been seduced.
Yeah.
And it's also very interesting that Darcy doesn't bring Georgiana to Rosings. It's a family Easter visit. Why didn't he bring his sister?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, we're so used to the story of Pride and Prejudice that we don't ask these questions.
In fan fiction, people always often come up with different explanations for this, right? Georgiana's intimidated by Lady Catherine, and on and on and on. So we find ways to work around a lot of what isn't in the text too, right?
And we're often making excuses for why Darcy isn't being more protective. But let's take what we know from the book.
Mhm.
Georgiana at age 15 leaves school. Does she go to live with Darcy? No, Darcy hires someone to take care of her and sets up her own household, not living with him. This doesn't strike me as a brother who is being a helicopter brother.
No. I understand that was very common though at the time, right? That for a young woman who didn't have a mother in particular to oversee her, take care of her, she would be set up in her own establishment, and that own establishment could be even within the same house, but she would have her own separate apartment. Because here he is, he's a young man, he's a bachelor, his lifestyle wouldn't necessarily be one that would be a good one for her to be exposed to. I mean, he's out at entertainments, he would have friends over, you wouldn't want to expose your still not out younger sister to, or daughter in some cases, I suppose it could have happened as well. But yeah, he's not a helicopter brother, not at all.
There's nothing wrong with what he did. It was very standard. But even as I've written scenes where he's saying, oh, you don't have to come to Rosings because I know it's so upsetting. Really, what you know about Darcy, he'd be saying, no, this is your duty as a Darcy. Come on,
Yeah,
get in the carriage, go.
yeah, it's very true. Yeah.
We're putting kind of a modern sensibility on what she would be expected to do.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
but I'm
Well,
by no means saying that my theory about Georgiana is the only theory there is.
mhm.
People can easily disagree with it, but I'm just trying to show you different things that you can see in Pride and Prejudice and what can be done with it.
I think all of those little bits that aren't spelled out in Pride and Prejudice is what allows so many of us to find an in to write different stories about it, because maybe she did have a baby, then what happens? You know, you can play around with why she doesn't live with Darcy, why she doesn't go to Rosings, and all of that. And if everything was spelled out as much as we might do in what we write today, then it would be harder to do what we do.
Yes. Well, I agree that that would make writing Austen-esque fiction much harder. And
Mhm.
it's one reason why we write Austen-esque fiction and not Charles Dickens fiction, because he tells us everything
Everything.
about his characters.
Yes.
There is no room to go.
Yeah. Does
Jane
he ever?
Austen gives us all these empty spaces. And I pointed out a few places where there's these hints in the text that there's something that we need to find. There's a lot I didn't point out because I haven't figured out what's hidden there yet. There's right after Elizabeth, Darcy's first proposal to Elizabeth, and just before he gives her the letter, she goes out for a walk and she goes, and Jane Austen tells us all the details of how she walks up the lane and there's a gate and there's this and there's that. And before she goes and sees Darcy in the grove and he gives her the letter, I have no idea why.
Yeah.
I'm sure she's trying to tell us something, but I don't know what it is. And there's lots of other things like that that I just sit there and stare at them and think, okay, there's something there. What is it?
It's a great book I have. I know I'm like being the one who's talking a lot here, but What Matters in Jane Austen, that I'm sure some of you at least have seen. Is it back there on your shelf? Yeah,
No, it
I always
isn't.
found
But
that.
nothing's Austen there,
Yeah.
but What Matters in Jane Austen is very
Yeah.
good too.
Yeah, I've always, that was really eye-opening to me as well. I read it years ago and said, oh yeah, lots of those little details that we wouldn't know about unless somebody starts pointing them out. And then I went back to my very old, very worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. I've had to retire from everyday use because it's so beaten up, to start teasing some of those out too. Oh, yeah. Anderberg never says anything. Interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I've had this theory about Anderberg. It's other people have had this theory too. I think you could make a good case that she's autistic.
Mhm.
She doesn't say anything. She doesn't pick up social cues. She wasn't able to learn to play the piano again. It doesn't take that much to sit at the piano and move your fingers. And she doesn't talk
Yeah.
in the book. So
Yeah.
just an interesting theory.
Mhm.
There's no answer and no evidence, but
No.
another thing fan fiction writers have done a lot with is different views on Anderberg, because Jane Austen gives us so much room there.
Mhm. Yeah. It's a great talk. Very interesting.
Thank you. Oh, more questions from YouTube. So 2 questions from YouTube here. Patty wants to know my thoughts on if Georgiana could have had a miscarriage. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Perfectly likely. Still could have changed her body, and boy, that would make the whole story a whole lot easier, wouldn't it? And from Laurel and Natris, how do I feel about why Wickham chose Lydia when she had no dowry and her only other significant social connection was her sister's friendship with Darcy? Well, basically, if Lydia in Brighton had told Wickham that Elizabeth was in Derbyshire, he would likely have assumed that Elizabeth was on the verge of announcing an engagement to Darcy. He would know, Wickham would know that by eloping with Lydia Bennet, he would be throwing a monkey wrench in the works on the engagement, which he loves to throw monkey wrenches in Darcy's life. And number 2, Darcy is likely to be willing to pay him off to marry Lydia. And he wants money. She's a meal ticket if Darcy marries Elizabeth. And if Darcy doesn't, well, who cares? Then Lydia's just ruined. So I think that is why he targeted Lydia, who had nothing to offer, unless she was Darcy's sister-in-law, in which case she had a lot to offer. So that's my interpretation on that. But I will point out, if you take this story that I've told you about Georgiana being seduced by Wickham, possibly pregnant, it gives you some more reasons why Darcy is sympathetic towards Lydia Bennet and willing to rescue her, because he's talking about the same thing that happened to his own sister. He may disapprove of it, but he also wants to help her, just like he helped Georgiana. I think that's it from YouTube.
I think Arnie has a question.
Okay, Arnie.
Actually, it relates to what a lot of people have been saying, but I think it's important to step back as well and to think Jane Austen was a very, very careful writer. I think we can all agree when she wants to make something clear, it's unbelievably clear. And Ellen Moody created these incredible calendars for each of the novels that are unbelievably detailed and sometimes serpentine, where you find out a date and a place where someone was you have to bounce between chapter 6 and chapter 30 to put it together, etc. So she was a meticulous craftswoman. So if she left all these blank spaces, the real question is, since I don't think she anticipated Jane Austen fan fiction per se, I think that what she was trying to do as a writer was to provoke her readers to think and to provoke her readers to become engaged in an active way in the process of story generation, in a way. And why? Because especially if her audience was women, which I think she thought her primary audience would be women, because she's writing these amazing stories that are female-centered for just about the first time in literature. So why? Because I think she wants to get her mostly female readers to think and to question and to say, what is really going on in that corner, in that blank space? Because if you're in the character's point of view, they have blank spaces around them. And if you can provoke your readers to be, and also to love the story so much that you'll keep rereading them. Every time you reread them, you'll see more things. So I think that her agenda, which was, I think, an amazing agenda, was to educate. And it's like that line that Elizabeth says at the end to Jane, that is a kind of a mysterious line that pops in out of nowhere, where they're talking about Jane's feelings for Bingley, and then Jane refuses to own to Elizabeth that she loves, that Bingley might still love her, etc. And then Elizabeth says, we all love to teach, but we can only teach what is not worth knowing, which is something out of Buddhism rather than anything else. And what does it mean? It means that Jane Austen was not going to write a conduct book that was going to tell people how to behave. She's doing something much better. She's provoking you to think and to look at social interactions so that you'll figure out to be careful, to look beneath the surface, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to make that overarching point, because I think that's who she really was as a human being. She was an educator.
I think that's an excellent point. And she did tell an amazing story with very few details and made characters who were extraordinarily real. We all know people like this. We all know a Lydia Bennet. We all know a Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Many of us had Mrs. Bennets as mothers. We all know these things. So she's just amazing. Other questions about this talk or anything else, or the new book or whatever? This is actually supposed to be the official question and answer period, not related to the lecture, so I'll answer any other questions. Like, how do I get anything done with such a cute cat always distracting me? It's hard.
I'm just talking about Georgiana, who could have possibly been pregnant. I remember reading Jaff that Darcy came to Hertfordshire with Bingley and has barely been there, and he gets a letter from Mrs. Reynolds and says the rose has bloomed, or some allusion to the fact that Georgiana is in fact with child, and he immediately marries Elizabeth. I don't remember those details, and he takes her up to the middle of nowhere where Georgiana is there. They sleep in separate rooms, and eventually what happens is Georgiana tries to take her life. She doesn't die, but she does lose the baby. Does anybody know that? I mean, so that fits into sort of your scenario of she did become pregnant by Wickham.
Yes, no, I know that it's been used before in fan fiction, and I used it in Mr. Darcy's Obsession, which is what made me go do the research on it. And
Yeah.
Mr. Darcy's Obsession was a fun book to write, because one of the things that I think gets lost to the modern audience is how far Mr. Darcy was marrying down to marry Elizabeth.
Mhm.
We all tend to hear her say, he is a gentleman, I'm a gentleman's daughter. Well, she's a poor gentleman's daughter who has not taken good care of her estates, and she has no connections, and her mother is a tradeswoman. It's not an equal match. It's not even a near equal match. It's a very unequal match. And the fact that Darcy persists after her refusal and makes this unequal match tells me a great deal about the power of his affection for her and his love for her. And I'm afraid to look at Arnie as I'm telling this, because I know his theories are different. But I think that's the true romance. You understand the romance better if you understand the big gap between them and what
Right.
he's doing. And so when I wrote Mr. Darcy's Obsession, I decided I was going to deliberately increase the gap to try and get that through to readers. So in Mr. Darcy's Obsession, Mr. Bennet has died. They're not in the hedgerows, but Elizabeth is now living with the Gardeners as not an unpaid servant, but she's helping out in the household and helping with the kids in exchange for room and board, because there's no place else to live. The other rest of the family are with the Phillipses in a tiny room.
Right.
Because I wanted to bring out that Darcy's feelings are so powerful that he will marry way down if that's the only way he can get Elizabeth.
And doesn't Jane Austen make clear, or maybe I'm just interpreting it this way, that Darcy, one of the things that he fell in love with regard to Elizabeth was her lack of pretense. You know, you said it yourself. Here is this tall, handsome man with all this money and huge estate, etc. But all the, what do you call them, matchmaking mamas in the ton were only after his money and the prestige of being Mrs. Darcy. They didn't care. They saw him as a stack of, 10,000 pound notes or 1,000 pound notes. So, she came from more humble beginnings. And if her father was in trade, would he have gone that low? But he saw something in her that he had never seen in another woman. And that's why we write fan fiction.
Yes, because we want to tell all those different stories.
Correct. You can interpret so many things so many ways. But your talk about what was behind the scenes or hidden, just fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad you found it interesting. So, okay, and it's probably getting to be about time for me to be turning things over